Hello, everybody. My name is Judy Checo, and I am an alum of the East-West Psychology Department, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Matt Siegel. Matt is a PhD, a transdisciplinary researcher, philosopher, and teacher, applying process relational thought across the natural and social sciences. He is associate professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness Department here at CIIS. And his presentation is titled Remembering the Repressed with Jung and Steiner.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Helgi. Thanks to the East-West Psychology Department for hosting this conference. I teach in the PCC program, as was mentioned, and Jung is celebrated in so many programs, and as Rick was saying, is really a major influence on this entire university. I'm going to be talking about a particular religious tradition and the psychology of that tradition, Christianity. And I do so in the context, first of all, a school where East and West met decades ago in a city where East and West have met and mingled. And CIS, I think, is really one of the places in academia and higher education striving for a planetary culture. And there are different ways of approaching what a planetary culture might look like. There's a way in which consumer capitalism has brought the whole world together, but with a very shallow type of culture, right? That was universal in a sense, but flat and leveling of all cultural difference, right? And I think what CIS is attempting is a more richly textured and deep form of planetary consciousness and planetary culture that would not require that we give up the particularities of the places and traditions, religions, and spiritualities that we each inherit. Now, of course, there are many world religions, and each of them has striven for its own form of universality. Christianity, of course, is one of them. Islam, Buddhism. There are attempts to articulate a deep spiritual sense of what the human being is that have come from every continent, right? And so I don't have an answer as to exactly what the achieved planetary culture or consciousness will look like, but I'm going to try to approach a particular tradition, Christianity, of which there are a few billion people who actively identify with that tradition, and then many others of us who are in the West that, whether we like it or not, have been influenced consciously and unconsciously by it. And I don't want to just cover, and don't have time to cover, all of the rich archetypal dimensions of this tradition, which itself is very syncretic and was from the very beginning. I want to look in particular at a facet of Christianity that I think is quite relevant today, and namely that is the way that Christianity has treated evil. I think, as Rick Tarnas was hinting at earlier, we're in a great descent right now. There's a tremendous split happening in this country and across many countries where we're tempted to project evil onto the other. And Jung was constantly trying to remind us that this tendency towards evil, the shadow, it exists in each of us. And unless each of us can pursue what he called individuation, that will probably destroy ourselves, right? So I'm going to try to surface this shadow dimension of Christianity and how it has related to the question of evil. And I'm going to do so in a comparative way by bringing Jung into dialogue with Rudolf Steiner, who, how many of you heard of Rudolf Steiner, just so I have a sense? Oh, good, great. He's an Austrian philosopher, spiritual teacher, contributed to so many different arts and sciences. And the headquarters of anthroposophy in Dornach, Switzerland, is like 50 miles away from where Carl Jung and Emma, his wife, lived on Lake Zurich. And actually, Emma Jung would travel to the Goetheanum to study fairy tales Now, Jung and Steiner certainly knew of each other. Jung barely mentions anthroposophy and usually does so, and Steiner in a disparaging way. And same goes for Jung when he mentions, or Steiner when he mentions Jung. And so, as often is the case with these great geniuses, it's hard for them to meet and see each other. The light that each of them was radiating is just a little bit too bright, perhaps. But I'm going to try to show how they can mutually enhance one another's insights. So, first, let me share a little autobiographical story to situate myself in relation to this topic. My parents are mixed. My father is Jewish. My mother is evangelical Christian, and I grew up with, these two biblical traditions, and by the time I was 9 or 10, I remember this episode when I was in middle school, and I think it was the second time that Bill Clinton was running for president, and one of my friends who happened to be quite Baptist, or at least his parents were, we were 10, so, he said to me, I hope you'll tell your parents not to vote for Bill Clinton. He's a devil worshiper. Did you know that? And I was kind of taken aback by that statement. I hadn't really thought much about politics yet as a 9 or 10-year-old. I hadn't thought much about religion even. My mom being evangelical, she would talk to me a lot about it, but she didn't force me to go to church. And my dad was kind of a lapsed Jew. He thought he was atheist. When I went to undergrad and studied philosophy, I had a talk with him, and he realized he's agnostic. So, but this was my first introduction to the strange marriage in the U.S. Despite our founders wanting church and state to be kept distinct, very much in the course of my lifetime, I've seen that gap narrow and narrow to the point now where Christian nationalism is resurgent and in many respects in charge of every branch of government. And so as a teenager, I started reading Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking, and really getting into the sciences, and in relationship to Christianity and the role that I saw it having, the role that it was playing in politics and in our world. It struck me, and what I knew about it from my mother and what I'd experienced in churches that I had been brought to, it struck me as, for my 14-year-old imagination, right, perhaps the most absurd of all the world religions. It's uniquely bizarre, just the whole story. I couldn't quite understand it. When I was 17 or 18, I had a very influential psychology teacher. His name was Kai Ennis. And he introduced me to Carl Jung. And I began to learn about the psychology of religion. And I realized that as much as I might want to escape this tradition, the archetypal complexes that are at play within Christianity and Judaism and the whole biblical tradition were very much inside of me. A little bit later, I had my first psilocybin mushroom experience, and at that point I was more or less identified as a Buddhist, even though I had read my Jung, and Jung warns Westerners, don't go searching far and wide and try to appropriate exotic traditions, because you'll eventually realize that you're running away from home, as it were, and you need to get in touch with the archetypes that are most present in your local cultural context. But I ate some mushrooms for the first time and had this very powerful experience of what I can call the Christ archetype. And it made me realize, in addition to reading Jung, now experientially, I couldn't escape this. And so that began almost 20 years now of research and an attempt to recover and remember what I had been repressing, right? So there's a personal aspect to this, but I also think collectively, for those of us who are citizens of the United States, for those of us who were born and raised in the West, which is not all of us in this room, I can't assume that, I think there's a need to re-engage with a tradition that we may have run from, because it's very much still present and powerful in our world. And if we continue to repress it, I fear that its power will be co-opted by forces that would really bring us further down into this descent and into the underworld and into a terrible civilizational crisis, or an intensification of a crisis that we're already in. So Jung, of course, was always careful to distinguish metaphysical claims from psychological claims. He was constantly saying, look, I'm talking about psychic reality, and whether or not God or Christ or Satan or the angels are metaphysically real is sort of beside the point, right? They're real experientially. They live in our psyche and they affect our behavior. They affect our sense of what is valuable and important. And so it's best to engage these complexes, these religious myths and archetypes with as much consciousness as we can. As Jung puts it, he says, I regard the psyche as real. They, and I think he was speaking there to the predominant, more or less materialist culture that he was surrounded by. I regard the psyche as real. They believe only physical facts and must consequently come to the conclusion that either the uranium itself or the laboratory equipment created the atom bomb. Right? And so he wanted to remind human beings that we have agency, and that agency, the agency of the ego, is always in tension with the degree to which we are aware of our own unconscious. Right? And the individuation process is this, in a sense, the descent of the ego, so as to become more aware of all of the other archetypal complexes at work in the psyche, the ego being just one among them. So Jung continues that God, whatever else we call it, remains an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, right? And so I think from a Jungian perspective, whether or not we consciously believe in God, there is a sense in which everything that is unconscious in relationship to the ego more or less functions as a divine ground or as God, right? And, reading statements like this from Jung as a teenager was quite revelatory for me. So I want to run through what Jung has to say about how Christianity deals with this question of evil, beginning with Answer to Job, which he wrote late in his life, and then touching a bit on what he has to say in another book that he wrote in the early 50s called Aeon. And then I'll move through to introduce Rudolf Steiner's approach and understanding of evil and the role of Christ in holding the tension of the shadow, and then explore this statue. This is a wood carving that Steiner and others worked on in the late 19-teens and early 20s, called The Representative of Humanity. And I think it's a powerful symbol that can help illustrate the nature of evil for us. So I'm sure most of you have read Answer to Job. If you haven't, the basic idea there, which Jung wrote this book in a sort of fever, as a fever dream. He was sort of possessed by this struggle he had had for a lot of his life to deal with the way in which there was this imbalance in Christianity. And so in the book of Job, you have basically Satan tempting Yahweh into torturing this very devoted man, Job, so as to prove to Satan that he really does have faith. And in this book, this biblical text, Jung interprets a process whereby the Creator, Yahweh, realizes in torturing Job and that Job remains faithful, that actually the creature becomes more moral than the Creator. And there's a sense in which Jung recognized how the Creator is thereby changed by the creature. And in a form of an application of Jung's understanding of psychological compensation. He thinks that this encounter, whereby Yahweh recognizes Job's moral superiority, in a sense, this necessitated the incarnation, that Yahweh had to become human. Yahweh had to become, in some sense, identified with and suffer existence, birth, life, and death as a human being in order to reach the moral level that Job was reflecting back, right? And in this book of Job, Satan is functioning as a kind of doubting thought in Yahweh, and suggesting to Jung, again, that Yahweh was quite unconscious, that there was a huge shadow operative in the Godhead at this stage. And there's a way in which a depth psychological reading of the Bible shows not just the evolution of human consciousness, but the evolution of divine consciousness as well, and the co-creative relationship that the human being and the divine are in over the course of thousands of years. So Yahweh must become human, Yahweh must incarnate, and this leads to the Christ event, right? Now, the thing is, as Jung would then go on to discuss in more depth in his book Aeon, well, actually that was before the book of Job, but as is mentioned in Job and in Aeon, this incarnation of Christ doesn't really correct the imbalance here, because Christ is often identified as the light and as perfect, the perfect God-human, the perfect image of the divine. And from Jung's point of view, that doesn't fully complete the need for the reconciliation of the Godhead between light and dark. The incarnation of Christ immediately calls forth, in Jung's view, the Antichrist, which would be the shadow to the light. Jung calls this Antichrist shadow dimension Lucifer, which is a bit odd because Lucifer is the light bearer. And so one of the reasons I'm wanting to bring Steiner into the picture here is that he has a more differentiated understanding of evil that I'll unpack in a moment, where there's both Lucifer, who's the being of light, the extreme form of, say, escapist spirituality, and then there's Ahriman, a name he borrows from Zoroastrianism, which is this being of materialistic and rigidly intellectual and reductionistic forces, right? And so rather than evil just being contained in this one Luciferian being or satanic being, Steiner divides these and shows how Christ is trying to hold attention there. Let's move on to the next slide, please. This is from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I'll just read it for you. Like every other being, I am a splinter of the infinite deity, which is a very Gnostic point of view. We are psychic processes we do not control. Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Its true life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. Yet I have never lost the sense of something that lives and endures underneath the eternal flux. What we see is the blossom which passes. The rhizome remains. And so, before I turn to Steiner, I just want to dwell on the importance for Jung of this process of individuation, at the same time that he would acknowledge how profoundly interconnected we all are through the collective unconscious. He was very concerned, because he lived through World War II, of the danger of mass-mindedness and collectivist movements that lead to the human being foregoing their individuality and becoming possessed by whatever he thought Wotan, this German pagan deity, had taken over during World War II, leading the Germans into the tragedy that we all know so well as the Holocaust. And I think in the U.S. we can similarly see the ways in which forms of collectivism can lead us astray. And Jung would always remind us that, the real danger is lurking in the depths of each of us as individuals. And individuation is not individualism, right? Individuation is, in a sense, in the unique way that only each of us can, finding our relationship to the collective, not just to our culture and our society, but to the deep archetypal ground that reaches back through the entire history of life into the depths of the cosmos itself. As Rick was saying earlier, we are all expressions of this universe, but each of us is a unique expression of the universe. And it's in connecting to that uniqueness through the process of individuation that we can restore a sort of wholeness that would not just be a mass-mindedness. So let's move to the next slide, please. So here's Steiner. Steiner wrote probably 15 or so, maybe 15 or 20 books in his life, but there's 300 volumes of lectures that were transcribed. And so this is from a lecture. It achieves nothing to say, I avoid the Luciferic, I avoid the Ahrimanic. That is foolish talk. For one cannot do that. One can only establish the balance between the two. But this to and fro of the human being between Ahriman and Lucifer must take place. Otherwise, the human personality could not develop. If the human did not have the spirit that works and creates through resistance, the human personality would not be able to develop. It's only through resistance that the human personality develops, right? And so Jung would often make similar statements about, why should there be this process of differentiation that can almost and often does become a sense of alienation, rather than going along with the dominant Christian understanding, going back to St. Augustine, Aquinas, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. They were mostly influenced by Plotinus, this view of evil as a mere privation, as a mere absence, as a lack of good, and having no positive existence in and of itself. Jung in Aeon, particularly in the chapter on Christ as a symbol of the self, just goes to town, totally destroying the arguments of these early church fathers about evil as a mere privation. They're basic logical errors that they keep making because they're so possessed by this archetype of Christ as pure light and perfection. And Steiner also thinks that evil has a positive existence and has an important role to play in the evolution of human beings. And we can't just split from it and reject it and say we're going to defeat and eliminate it. That's not possible. And in some sense, my takeaway from what they both have to tell us about evil is that rather than thinking of evil as something that we could purify ourselves of and isolate and then eliminate, it's actually that very maneuver that is evil, that very splitting whereby we project all of the evil onto the other. That is evil itself, right? And so, as Steiner is saying here, there was this differentiated sense of evil, of Lucifer and Ahriman, this being of escapist spirituality and this reductive materialist mechanist impulse. In their right context, the Ahrimanic intellect and this effort to be worldly and live on the earth is appropriate. And in its proper context, spirituality, the arts, mysticism, these Luciferic principles are also appropriate and important, right? But we have to hold the balance. So let's go to the next slide, please. And, speaking of that balance in Aeon, I'll explain that slide in a second. Jung talks about Christ incarnating in the age of Pisces. And if you know the constellation Pisces, it's these two fish, one in the vertical direction and one in the horizontal direction. And Jung remarks that while in the early Christian period, pre-Renaissance, there was very much a transcendent orientation, like the upward pointing fish. And then around the Renaissance, around 1500, let's say, there was a dramatic shift where people like Ficino start translating dialogues of Plato's that hadn't been available in Europe, and all of a sudden natural science is coming into its own, and there's a more earthly focus, right? A horizontal focus. The age of exploration begins. Capitalism begins, right? And so while it might at first seem like what happened after the Renaissance was anti-Christian in a way, it's just another side of Christianity, I think, that led into secularism, that led into science, and this monotheistic obsession with the good in the early part of the history of Christianity in Europe, then shifts to a monotheistic obsession with the one scientific truth about nature, right? Steiner says something very similar about this shift which occurred around 1500. He dates it a little bit earlier, early 1400s, but the basic idea is that a new consciousness is forming that directs us to be more attuned to the material world on the one hand through, again, exploration, the growth of capitalist economies, the development of natural science, but on the other hand also more individualized, more interior in our experience of ourselves as selves, as egos, right? And so this is an evolutionary process that both Jung and Steiner see occurring. So while Jung was always careful, as I mentioned earlier, to avoid making metaphysical claims and spoke only as a physician, trying to treat his patients and acknowledge religious symbols and complexes and beings as of tremendous importance phenomenologically for people's experience, he didn't want to say too much about whether they really existed. Steiner, rather than taking that kind of careful psychological orientation, took a spiritual orientation and said that, look, these are real spiritual beings. There is an angelic hierarchy of many beings that are involved behind the scenes that we may be unconscious of in shaping the course of cosmic and human evolution. One of the reasons that Jung was critical of Steiner is precisely because he didn't respect this distinction between psychological reality and metaphysical or spiritual reality. But I think there's a way in which which has been done by many who have compared these two before. We can do a Jungian reading of Steiner, or we could do a Steinerian reading of Jung, right? But here we're looking at Steiner, I think in the late 19-teens, or maybe it could have been 1920, 21. He's working on carving this statue, and this is the Christ figure. And you can see the sort of plaster model he's working on there, and then this is the full image on your right. Now, where, as I mentioned earlier, Jung tends to collapse what Steiner differentiates here all into Lucifer. A similar thing is happening in Goethe's Faust, where Mephistopheles is, a satanic shadow figure, right? But Steiner thinks that Goethe similarly was collapsing the Luciferic and Ahrimanic, and that really most of the time, if you've read Faust, Goethe's Faust, Mephistopheles plays the role of Ahriman, who's you're trying to bring Faust in that Ahrimanic direction. And I think Steiner's differentiation here really helps us understand why it is that we can't just run away from evil and split off from evil, but we really need to hold the tension, again, between this dipolar understanding of evil, right? Lucifer, again, as inflated spirituality, pride, escape from matter, and Ahriman as this cold materialistic force, hard intellect, and the denial of spirituality. Steiner, in his account of human history, would say Lucifer actually incarnated in flesh and blood human form around 3000 BCE, he says, in China, and that this being was the source of so many of the deep spiritual traditions of Asia, like Taoism, where and then he would say it fed into the mystery of religions in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world, and that incarnation of Lucifer and this deep spiritual wisdom needed to be present for those who witnessed and who lived in the first centuries after Christ to really understand what the Christ event was. So you've got Lucifer incarnating 5,000 years ago. You've got Christ incarnating around 0, and then Steiner also looks ahead to the future. Any day now, or into the third millennium, when Ahriman will also incarnate in flesh and blood, or perhaps in some kind of cyborg form would be appropriate, given the rise of computer technology and transhumanism and all of that. And so, whether you take that literally or symbolically, again, like we can read Steiner through Jung or Jung through Steiner, I think it speaks to, again, the need to hold this tension, and that there's no escape from the fact that Ahriman will incarnate, and there's no escape from the fact that we have to reckon with the tremendous power of technology, which is an Ahrimanic issue. So let's look at this statue together. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So we'll have to look at this close up because there's so much detail. Let me see if I can. Here. So we've got Christ in the middle, holding up his left hand, and this winged being, this is Lucifer coming down. And Steiner is very careful to point out that, in a sense, the Christ being in the middle is not trying to do any harm to Lucifer or Ahriman. Really, Christ is receiving them in love and trying to hold the tension between the two, but that Lucifer can't handle that love, and one of Lucifer's wings breaks, and Lucifer's falling, it's kind of upside down here. And then beneath Christ, in the hollow of the earth, is Ahriman, and Christ's right hand is reaching down to Ahriman. And similarly, Ahriman just can't handle the love. And Steiner describes how the gold veins of the earth are wrapping themselves around Ahriman, binding him. But there's actually a doubling going on, and so there's two Lucifers and two Ahrimans in this carving to represent the supersensible nature of these beings, the supersensible nature of Lucifer, I should say, and the subsensible nature of Ahriman. But then there's also their earthly presence and the way in which we encounter them every day in our most mundane activities. Right, so Steiner wanted to represent the sense in which maybe one way of translating this into Jungian language would be to say there's the archetypes themselves and then the archetypal images, right? And so it's as if Steiner wanted to depict the way in which we can step down the intense numinous power of the supersensible Lucifer and the subsensible Ahriman by meeting them in our everyday lives in less intense form, which is sort of an invitation to say, like, well, we need to work with them and not split off from evil, but recognize that the challenge is to hold the tension between the two. So you have Ahriman here above Christ's right shoulder, and Lucifer here above Christ's right shoulder, and then Ahriman here in their less severe and intensely numinous forms. Then there's this at the top right, which is referred to by Steiner as cosmic humor. And I find it so interesting that maybe independently, or maybe Steiner was reading more Jung than he lets on, Jung wrote a lot about the symbol of the Trinity and its lack of completeness. It was missing the fourth, right? There's a wonderful essay on the psychology of the Trinity that Jung wrote, and then a chapter on the problem of the fourth, where for Jung it's the material principle, it's the feminine, it's the shadow, it's evil itself that's left out of this powerful, brilliant articulation of the symbol of the Trinity that came out of the early church fathers. And Jung, thought that the Catholic Church, through the Assumption of Mary in the mid-20th century, was beginning to address this. I think that would be a more inward example of a transformation that would be trying to occur in this Christian obsession with the light and the way in which Roman imperialism and then the Catholic Church, inheriting that imperialist impulse in a spiritual way, in a very patriarchal way, could start to bring in more balance. But I think probably the church would need to have a female pope if they would have any hope of fully moving more in that direction, or allow women to be priests. But interestingly, you see in Steiner's representative of humanity statue a similar quaternity manifesting. And so what is the role of cosmic humor here? Steiner was worried that we would risk becoming too sentimental, taking ourselves too seriously in this epic battle between the light and the dark. And so we needed to bring in this element of the comedic. We need to be able to laugh at ourselves, right? And I think that's another way of getting at this missing fourth, to bring completion to what would otherwise be a Trinitarian formulation, which, as beautiful as it is still leaving out this unconscious dimension, right? And so both Jung and Steiner seem to recognize that. So I'll just start to come to a close here, and we can have plenty of time for discussion. So let me share this line from Jung in Aeon, which again, I think it was first published in 1951. It's from the chapter Christ, the Symbol of the Self, where Jung is reflecting on some of the differences between the biblical religions, Judaism and Christianity, where there's a real exacerbation of the opposites, and a real sense of the moral importance of the differentiation of light and dark, which, a great contrast would be in Buddhism. You don't get that sense of the significance of sin and trying to overcome sin. Though, of course, even within Christianity, if you look at some of the apocryphal writings like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it's a very striking statement said from Jesus to Mary. There is no sin, right? And so early Christianity was this matrix of possibilities, and one particularly more patriarchal form of it won out. But nonetheless, it's quite obvious that what makes Christianity unique is this sense of the all-important difference between good and evil, right? And Jung asks if this, he says, I quote him, "This exacerbation of the opposites, much as it increases suffering, may after all correspond to a higher degree of truth." He's not sure, but what he means there, I think, is maybe we can't escape the moral dimension here. It might be too luciferic in Steiner's sense to just think we could rise above the battle between good and evil, even while we want to recognize what evil really is, as I said earlier, is precisely this tendency to split and project evil onto the other. Jung continues, I should merely like to express the hope that the present world situation may be looked upon in the light of the psychological rule alluded to earlier, compensation basically, and the importance of bringing the opposites together. And he finishes, today, humanity as never before is split into two apparently irreconcilable halves. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. So, as we in this country deal with the rise of a particularly, in my view, idolatrous form of Christianity, Christian nationalism, you could even say Christo-fascism, I think the way forward would be to look deeper into these symbols that are at play, try to come to into a deeper connection and even communion with the meaning of the Christ archetype, the meaning of Antichrist, the satanic, the Luciferic and Harmonic in Steiner's sense, and let's not let them have it for themselves, right? I think to reach the people who feel so fervently committed to a particular tradition, perhaps as a kind of judo move, we might be able to deflate their sense of being the pure source of goodness by reminding them of some of the things Jesus said, for example, rather than just in a sense throwing this entire tradition into the waste bin. Perhaps we could remember what's been repressed and redeem it and find a new way forward as a nation and as a species. And the last thing I'll say is to harken back to what I was saying about the importance of individuation for Jung. Steiner says that the human being is not just another species of animal or a new kingdom of life. Teilhard de Chardin says something similar. And this isn't, in my view, to elevate the human being and say, oh, we're the most important beings on this planet and we don't need to worry about the rest of the community of life. Not at all. It's actually calling us to be responsible for our power, to take care of this planet. And if the human being is a new kingdom of life, what that entails is that each of us is actually our own species. Each individual is a unique species of organism, right? And so that means no one else can tell you how to individuate. No one else can tell you how to reconcile these powers of spirit and matter. There's no universal prescription that could resolve that for all of us. And Jung was very adamant, especially towards the end of his life with the Cold War heating up, that the real danger was inside each of us. And to the extent that individuals failed to individuate and reconcile these opposites within themselves, to that extent, the collective, our political and cultural and social situation would continue its downward spiral into fragmentation, mass-mindedness, and the projection of evil onto the other. So not only is Jung still relevant, I think his insight into the nature of individuation is quite urgent right now. So I'll stop there and invite questions. Thank you.
So thank you so much for that, Matt. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'll bring the mic around. I think I saw how this is. I'm not sure. Let's see how we reach here.
One more. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful. I might ask you to come here.
I didn't need to be first, but wonderful, Matt. I know you've been speaking so much and writing so much and brilliantly about Whitehead and Schelling and interlocutors about those two. But wow, I really hope you do more with Jung and Steiner, who, as we once had a study group here 35 years ago on Jung and Steiner, and one of the things we talked about was just how this was a conversation that didn't happen between the two of them that needs to happen, these two giants. And and you're really, really good. You've always been a great interviewer of people and everything like that, and getting insight. And I hope you write about this. It's a book that should be written, and I hope you keep evolving your thoughts about this. The second, more specific thing is, what a great idea about bringing humor, integrating that with Jung's idea of the fourth. Because if you look at I think it can be off-putting for some people, for obvious reasons, when Jung says, look, the fourth is missing, and in that fourth is matter, the feminine, and evil. Oh yeah, that's really great. Easy for you as a guy to say. But if we recognize that the fourth is a kind of multivalent dimension or container of these multiple, quite distinct phenomena and principles, humor is a great fourth part of that multivalence. Because if you look at that Trinity, and in many ways it's part of the Christian shadow, is that it can be, like almost all religions, a little over serious. I mean, it's partly because it's such a serious spiritual and moral project that all of them were on for very understandable reasons. But if the jester in the court, what just happened this week with the firing of Jimmy Kimmel, and it's so important. It is the trickster is a representative of the unconscious and a voice of it, and it's what helps keep a culture healthy and alive and vital, and bringing into equilibrium. And so I think that's a brilliant insight as you're looking at the Goetheanum, that great sculpture there. And thank you for bringing those two together. I never would have thought of that, and it's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm glad you connected it to our present situation with a tyrant who can't stand comedians making fun of him. I mean, it speaks precisely to the importance of humor for integrating the shadow. So, yeah.
So I'm actually just told that we have more time for questions. We're like 20 minutes, and so just raise your hand. And I will say, just so that everybody has a chance, including people online, if we could keep it to 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you, Matt. That was very thought-provoking. I'll be concise, but I have you inspired a couple of thoughts in me that I'm trying to form into a question. I haven't figured out how to do it. So I'll just present them to you, and hopefully you can do something. One is, so you mentioned Goethe's Faust, and I wonder if Goethe is connective tissue between Jung and Steiner, because they're both so strongly impacted by him. And this has probably already been talked, maybe Jung himself talks about this, and I don't remember it, but the answer to Job is almost articulating the same plot as Faust, in the sense that from the prologue in heaven to the end of part 2, you have, the prologue in heaven is modeled on the book of Job, and then Faust's salvation is by means of following the eternal feminine. And I wonder if that can be thought of not just as the means of Faust's redemption, but as a transformation in the Godhead as well. And then the second thought was where Jung and Steiner stand in relation to more heterodox Christian traditions like the Gnostic impulse and Manichaeism, Jakob Böhme's notion of the Abgrund, and so on. I wonder, where's the Abgrund in Steiner? Is that part of what's maybe missing there? And he's bringing humor in a way to kind of get to what, if materiality is what can't be articulated, or is pure will, or something like that, that maybe he's using humor to try to get there. Anyway, I feel those are connected somehow, but I can't figure out how.
Yeah, great questions, Jeff. I mean, on Goethe, I forgot to mention I mean, there's a lot of things I could have thrown into the talk that I left out, but I think that is the connective tissue, really, one of the connective tissues between Jung and Steiner. But when Jung is writing about the missing fourth, he brings in Goethe as an exemplification of the way in which the four psychological functions of intuition, feeling, sensing, and thinking play out, where in that narrative Jung sees Goethe in his own expressing his own dominant functions of intuition, feeling, and sensing, and his inferior function of thinking ends up manifesting unconsciously through the character of Faust. That would be Jung's view, and as a way of understanding what Steiner is doing with the Luciferic and harmonic polarities of evil. The Luciferic is all intuition and feeling, right? And the harmonic is all sensing and thinking. And when intuition and feeling become detached from sensing and thinking, you end up with some serious pathologies. You end up with a spirituality that's completely escapist and narcissistic, fleeing from conflict, fleeing from embodied life, right? And you end up with a form of science and technology that's completely divorced from the heart and from any sense of the human being as just being more than a product of an evolutionary process that's red tooth and claw, and we're just an apex predator, and so on. And so bringing these four psychological functions back together, I think, is something where Jung and Steiner can teach us a lot. And then what was the second part of your question? Oh, the aberrant. Yeah. I mean, Jakob Böhme is such a delicacy to read. I mean, such rich, sensuous imagery, alchemical, Kabbalistic influences there. Obviously, both all of that is flowing into Jung and Steiner as well. Both of them deeply influenced by the Gnostics. I often feel like Steiner doesn't talk very much about the Godhead or about the source of it all. It's almost like I get the sense he would say, like, well, don't kid yourselves. Like, let's focus a little bit more on the local spiritual situation on the earth, and then, we've got cycles within cycles within cycles of this cosmic evolutionary process. And yes, there's a divine underlying all of that, but let's be patient. We've got a few million more years of evolution before we can even begin to fathom what that might be. Jung, in terms of materiality as the missing fourth, he begins his essay on the problem of the fourth by looking at Plato's Timaeus, and there's so many triads in that dialogue, the same, the different, and the mixture, right? The same being analogous to the fixed constellations, the different being the movement of the planets through the fixed constellations, and then the mixture of the two, which gives rise, in Plato's view, to the world soul, the animating principle of the cosmos. But where's the fourth? And actually, it's not that Plato just leaves out the fourth. It's noted in its absence. The whole dialogue begins with Socrates saying 1, 2, 3 to his interlocutors, but where's the fourth? And that fourth interlocutor, I'm blanking on his name right now, was sick. Couldn't come that day, right? That's not just an accidental random thing that Plato puts at the beginning of the dialogue. That has deep significance. And then similarly, when Timaeus, the astronomer, in the dialogue is laying out this cosmology, there's this dark and difficult idea Plato tries to articulate. He calls it dark and difficult, which is the receptacle, or the chora, which you could say is the form of formlessness itself. How do you even begin to describe that? And that's another example of the missing fourth showing up in its absence, right in the middle of what was the most widely read Platonic dialogue in Europe until the Renaissance. And so it's always there, lurking in the background, having its influence, but precisely in being unconscious, or at the edge of consciousness. And so, maybe that receptacle or chora is akin to the aberrant that Dharma was writing about. Any other questions? Please. Is that okay if I choose? I mean,
Yeah, that's fine.
usurp your power.
Yeah. Go with the flow.
Thank you for that talk. That was wonderful. So, given that the problem of the fourth is so prevalent, it seems as though the symbols that we've inherited are insufficient, such that we can't completely integrate the missing fourth with them. And given that symbols can only arise out of the depths of the unconscious and we can't consciously create them, what might Jung say that we do in order to make it so that the symbols we already have can allow us to properly mend the split in our psyche?
Easy question.
No, it's a good one. That was one of the most important early insights for me in reading Jung, when he would talk about symbol and myth, and the way in which, as much as we need a new myth, we can't just engineer one, right? It has to erupt from the unconscious. And I think, the whole tradition of Western philosophy has had a very ambivalent relationship to imagination. The preference either for attending to the empirical world and what can be measured and is tangible and concrete, or that would be the empiricists, and then there's the rationalists who think that mathematics and logic, the realm of ideas, that's where truth would be found. And imagination's in the middle, right, of those two extremes. And because it's unruly, it's full of symbols whose meaning is ambiguous. It's erotically charged often. You never know when you drop into imagination what's gonna show itself to you. And so, Western philosophers, empiricists and rationalists, have been very suspicious of it. But I bring up imagination because I think Jung would, he cultivated and developed this method of active imagination, which is as much a process of discovery as it is of creation, and it's somewhere in between discovery and creation when you drop down into this process of unconscious imaginative production, or the creative imagination. The most brilliant artists have no idea how they create what they create, right? But everyone else, we acknowledge them as the creator of it. Well, you did that. And I guess I did. But in terms of recovering and or constructing symbols, I think it's very much that practice of active imagination where we're going to be able to accomplish that. It's a lot about being in between and holding that tension, just like Steiner would hold the tension between these two poles of evil, holding the tension between discovery and creation in our active imagination practice to allow the symbols in the midst that need to be of service to us today to rise into consciousness. I think that would be the approach I think Jung would suggest and did suggest.
Thank you.
Just gonna check in with our online folks and see if they have questions. Jonathan, do you have anything?
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Matt, for a fantastic talk. I have a question here. I'll pass on to Carol. Can you explain the connection between the yearning for the Antichrist and the arrival of Christ?
The yearning for the Antichrist. I don't know if anyone was yearning for the Antichrist per se, but I think Jung's point there is that, while in the answer to Job, it was clear that Yahweh was unconscious and had this shadow dimension, this doubting thought, which was identified with Satan, and Job, and being such a faithful human being, didn't denounce Yahweh and stayed faithful, and that this caused Yahweh to realize that God needed to become human, but that, for Jung, the Christ event didn't resolve this need for balance. There was still an imbalance because Christ was a being of pure light and perfection. And so, Jung is saying that there's this law of psychological compensation that in the Christian unconscious required that just as Christ incarnated, there needed to be a compensatory antichrist principle, which you can see manifesting in the book of Revelation, where John, whether the same as John who wrote the epistles or not, I think historians would say not the same author. Jung said it would be psychologically appropriate if it were the same author, because John of the epistles says God is love, and John in Revelation is expressing the compensatory side, where all of a sudden Christ comes back with a sword, right? And you really see the interplay of light and dark and the importance of reconciling the opposites playing itself out right there in the books of the New Testament, as these early Christians were going through this tremendous disruption and transformation of the psyche. So I don't know if anyone was longing for or yearning for the Antichrist, but it was made necessary by the overly rosy picture of the perfect being of Christ incarnating. I don't know if that provides enough context.
Maybe I can read the last line out that was kind of an exclamation part of the question. It said the arrival of Trump. So maybe this yearning for the Antichrist more on a social level, Carol was asking about. Or maybe relate the question more to our times as well.
Yeah. Well, I don't necessarily see Trump so much as an antichrist figure, but more as a symptom of the American id rising to the surface, a mirror for us in some sense. If we were to shift into the anthroposophical or Steinerian register, and think about Ahriman, we live in the time of Ahriman now, right? Or as Jung would say, we're no longer in the time of the vertical fish of the Pisces constellation, we're in the horizontal fish, where we're dominated by science and technology, and materialism has become more or less our common sense, to the point where even in our time here in San Francisco and in the New Age and the rebirth of a kind of spirituality, it's very often this form of spirituality gets co-opted by consumer capitalism. And I think that's an example of the power of Ahriman and Lucifer as collaborators. Steiner says, though they're opposite poles, they also collaborate quite frequently, and so this spiritual but not religious movement that is very positive in some sense is also very easily co-opted by capitalism and by this way in which everything can be commodified, which is a more harmonic tendency. And so in our Ahrimanic time, if we're looking for the Antichrist or the incarnation of Ahriman, I'd look more in the direction of Peter Thiel or Elon Musk, or what becomes of that sort of a movement towards attributing consciousness and even a kind of godlike power to artificial intelligence. That would be, I think if Steiner were alive today, he would say, that's the incarnation of Ahriman happening, right? So let's not attribute more archetypal significance to Trump than we need to. How are we doing on
We have
time?
time for another?
I think we have like 3 more minutes.
Maybe one more question.
I have one more online.
Should we do? It's up to you.
Yeah,
There's a
maybe.
question over there.
There's a couple here in the room. I think Yeah, I think we're gonna go here,
Here,
Jonathan,
okay.
if that's okay. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go here.
I'm online. You're good. Can they hear online?
How's it, I think if you can come to the mic, it might be better,
I
and
can.
we're gonna.
Maybe I missed it, by the way. Thank you for being here. My name is Lang. Towards the end of your talk, you talked about, some of the things that Christ said that aren't as quoted that speak to the fourth element. Did you quote anything from Christ in that regard? And if not, could you share some or a resource that, maybe curate some of those? I think that would be really cool.
You want me to preach?
Come on, 3 minutes. Let's hear you preach it.
Well, what comes to mind as a way of avoiding the sort of splitting which is occurring in our society, the tendency to project all evil onto the other side, is this account of the Pharisees coming to Jesus and accusing him of immorally hanging out with the prostitutes and the beggars, and some have interpreted a particular scene where he's with potentially Mary Magdalene, who some early church fathers identified as a prostitute, which may or may not have been true. But the Pharisees say, "Why are you, cavorting with this woman? She's a sinner." And he doesn't answer at first, and they keep prodding him, and eventually he says, it's this beautiful line, "Let he among you who is free of sin be the first to cast a stone." He doesn't even look up at them, and then he asks the woman he was with, "Have they left?" And then they all walked away because they all knew that they weren't free of sin. And so it's lines like that, and then there's the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, there are examples of Christ being quite severe also in the Gospels, much less in the book of Revelation. But it's that refusal to judge, and this shift from an Old Testament sense of the law as the be-all and end-all, and Yahweh as this very vengeful, judgmental God. And there are examples of mercy in the Old Testament too, but the shift to Christ as the fulfillment of the law is actually a shift from just the imposition of laws that must be followed because God says so, to instead this understanding of love and the refusal to judge others, that I think is the real important lesson that could help us remind these really intense Christian nationalists of what their teacher actually, the lessons he wanted to bring to humanity. Because there's a lot of judgment. I mean, there's a lot of judgment among everyone, on every side, and I think that's a hard lesson, but how do you diffuse and defeat evil? Not by constellating this split and attempting to destroy it. You, in that way, become evil to defeat evil, which isn't going to help. But as is often the case, you see this in literature and you see it in world history, evil eats itself. And so when Christ says, "Turn the other cheek, love thy enemies," that might be perceived as pacifism, but it's actually a recognition of the fact that if you try to fight evil, you only feed it. Whereas if you meet it with love, it ends up destroying itself. Right? And so, those are a few of the teachings of Christ that I would suggest. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
So we have lunch next door, right now. And then we'll meet back here at 1:30. We start at 1:30.